We live today in the light of God's tomorrow. Both, or all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, all three of them record this powerful text in their book, the Transfiguration, which can only be in our imaginations what it must have been like in reality. Mark chapter 9, verses 2 through 9 say this: 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, led them up a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. And his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice: "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. And they were coming down the mountain. He ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. This may sound like a stretch, but we're going from there right to the future. In fact, we're going back to the future. A movie that was made and then remade in different story fashion, starring Michael J. Fox as Marty. His friend, the scientist, had built a time machine, and it was one that could go back to the future, or it could go back to the past. And he had a concern in his hometown. He went there in the 1950s, back to the past. He hadn't been born yet, and he was concerned, somehow had found and got word that his parents might not have a chance to meet, even though they were in the same high school. Now, his father especially was relatively nerdy, and there are some entertaining things about the movie, one of which is that Michael J. Fox somehow does some incredible skateboarding stunts and plays guitar exactly like Chuck Berry did, with great guitar licks as well. There's signs of quaintness all over this 50s movie. I'm thinking there are church keys, not like we used to open up the doors here, but rather there were no twist-off tops on pop. You had to use a pop opener. There were crisply dressed, uniform attendants who not only filled up your car with gas, but as they were doing that, others would clean your windshields, check your oil, make sure the seat mats were clean, as well as checking the air and make sure they were in your tire as they should be. Those days are gone, my friends. So amid all of this warm frivolity, the movie has an incredibly serious theme to ponder. And I think it was the second or third time I saw it a while ago. It struck me. Possessing knowledge of the future creates momentous responsibility in the present. I'll give you a clue now. I hope you connect that with what we just read from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9. When you look at the movie, the boy is told, among other things, the scientist, his friends, this zany old guy, tells him, whatever you do, don't alter the future. Don't even attempt to do it in any way. And the boy works very hard, Marty does, to ensure the future goes and develops just as it had been experienced in the past. So he makes the conditions, or tries to, makes them right to lead his parents to be attracted to each other, so that one day not only he, but his older brother and younger sister actually can have an existence, a birth and life in the future. Now, Marty in Back to the Future knows the future, and he knows the burden that it bears, and he also works toward its fulfillment. So again, I remind you to think about knowledge of the future creates awesome responsibility in the present. And I'm saying that about a make-believe movie, and I'm saying that about something that happened 2,000 years ago, but I'm saying it to you this morning because the same is true for us today. Knowledge of the future creates awesome responsibility in the present. For example, Dr. Cagle isn't here this morning, his good wife Melinda is, but I'm sure if he were here he would agree that as an oncologist, disease spreads sometimes into your body. And Dr. Cagle probably does all the tests that you possibly could do, and he checks and he rechecks. And he's the one person, and perhaps the first person clearly, who knows what the future holds for that one that is his patient, who is sick. And the patient has, even in Dr. Cagle's mind, not long to live. He's told me, perhaps he shared with you, the most difficult thing to do, the greatest joy, is to share with people they're clean, they're free, they're cancer-free. But when the patient's days are few, at least at first, it's probably just Dr. Cagle, his patient, that he's going to tell. He's the only one that knows. Now you would think, as I thought when Dr. Cagle first mentioned that to me, I thought to myself, well, that takes all kinds of pressure off the doctor. He can't do anything. He's done everything he possibly could. But you listen to Dr. Cagle, it's almost like the opposite. The exact opposite is true. He enters the room. He knows what he has to say. He knows he has to be straightforward. Right away, the family, you can just picture it, stands at attention. They look to the doctor. They are pleading in their eyes. Their hearts are pounding. He knows the awful truth. That is the future. And it seems to me it's the heaviest responsibility of all. An executive at a big firm, big merger's coming. His company is going to be bought out by a major player. Stock's going to skyrocket. He's on the golf course with his friend who's thinking about his children's education and tells him on the first tee, thinking about going into the stock market. You got any ideas or suggestions for me? Well, he knows how those stocks are going to split and just boom within his own company when that merger takes place. It's called inside trading, and no one's supposed to know, and it's illegal. But what would it hurt? I mean, he's doing this for his kids, and he's my friend. He remains silent. But for a few moments, there's that burden, and I believe each and every one of us have it. We have that burden of knowing the future in some way that somebody else doesn't. And it's a tremendous responsibility for us to carry. As I prayed this morning early, I miss Charlie. I know not as much probably as many of you, Charlie Montgomery. A week ago, last Saturday. I've lived over half my life. I mean, if I didn't, I would live to be 132. Charlie, if he was still here and did, he'd live to be 136. It's not realistic. And I don't want to sound morbid about this. I can't remember exactly when it happened for me, but one of the main changes of aging that's been my experience is that I am tending to view everything from this point on, whenever that began, in view of my death. And I know that might sound morbid or might sound rather depressing, but I don't mean it to be, and I don't feel it is to me. in many ways, it seems to me that we're reminded. Charlie was 2 years older than I was. We're all mortal. The movie What About Bob, the psychiatrist's son, constantly was reminding his adult friend who was living on the edge, we're all going to die. And it seems like it's the easiest to talk about that when we're not dying. But we're all mortal. Death is sure to come. And right now for me, I have to tell you, my days that are left are shaped by that event. Because time is precious. And I want to make the very most of it, the very best of it. And there's a sense of urgency that seems to come that I didn't have when I was 20 or 30. It's because you have your whole life ahead of you. Then you start realizing in your mid-60s, life's short. Life's gone really fast. Knowledge of the future gives opportunity for us to live responsibly. And it does start when we're 20 and 30, and perhaps even younger. Time remaining matters. Now let's go back to the past, 2,000 years, the transfiguration of Jesus, a glimpse into the future. I mean, we're talking now about the ultimate future. We're talking about God's future. And we as Jesus' disciples have the greatest responsibility in the world. When I read this, and I'll never read this text the same. He had Peter, James, and John with him, but he's talking to us today with the same sense of urgency he talked to them 2,000 years ago. Because we now are Jesus' disciples. Peter, James, and John and the others have gone to heaven a long time ago. And I'm reminded when I read this, in all three of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it takes place in the middle of the Gospel. In other words, in the middle of Jesus' life, in the middle of his ministry. And it's strange for us because I'm not going to try to explain it because it's out of this world. It's filled with symbolism. But here's Peter, James, and John. High on a mountain. That tells you something right away. The more we go up, we believe that today, the closer we are to God. Shekinah, sometimes we can be in the clouds, even though we've got our feet planted on probably some mountain. And Jesus' garments shined, white brilliance, again to remind us, to tell us God was there. This is real. This isn't a dream. This isn't something somebody imagined. This happened. This is reality. God was there. God spoke. Jesus Christ was transfigured, changed somehow. It was a holy place. And he was with the greatest leader, Moses, and the greatest prophet, Elijah. And then after moments, time had to stand still. There was no one there except Jesus. For that, he talked to them. You wonder what he said to Elijah and Moses. You wonder if Moses and Elijah spoke. But it's God's voice. Reminds you a lot of baptism, the baptism of Jesus with John. Totally different world from there. What a difference a year, 18 months makes. But the same voice, the same experience. God says, attaboy. God says, well done. Go get him, son. This is my son. Well, that was enough for Peter. He wants to make 3 booths. We read dwellings. Some translations say tabernacles. The present moment frees time. We're not going anywhere, Peter says. We're going to stay right here. You ever been in an experience, a vacation, a relationship, a moment where you didn't want it to end? You didn't want it to stop. We want that mountain experience for always. That's what Peter thought. I don't know what Peter thought. Maybe that's what he thought. If indeed he did, he was wrong. Peter wanted to build a booth because I believe, it says they were terrified. And I don't know if this was that literally. Sometimes that can be translated holy, worshipful, in awe. It can be a good thing. Sometimes it can mean scared out of your wits. I tend to lean toward that because of what Peter said. Let's build 3 booths. It's not that he didn't want anything to ever change again. He wanted to stay right. He didn't want to go down the mountain. I believe Peter knew. I believe Peter knew what was in store when they go down the mountain. Jesus had only lived half his life, but he was seeing everything in relationship to his death. He tells him earlier on, don't tell anybody about this experience of transfiguration till after I'm gone, after I've died, after I've been crucified. The Jewish Feast of Booths took place shortly after they were free. It's one of their first celebrations, the Jewish people. For all those years of slavery, they were in Egypt, and they were out of it. And they remembered that day when they were free from that point on, and they built a booth. They built booths to worship and to remember that God was with them in the wilderness, day after day, year after year, providing everything. He was their God. God gave them everything they stood in need of. And Peter certainly was looking forward to that day again when God and his people, all nations, would come together and tabernacle one with another. That's our hope. That's our dream. That's our prayer. And Peter saw Jesus with Moses and Elijah. And he assumed that the time had come, this long expected time. It doesn't get any better than this. The future had arrived. Let's go back to the present. Peter was wrong again, if indeed that's what he thought, that the future had arrived. The future had been seen. He saw it, but it had not fully come. The transfiguration is in the middle of Jesus' ministry. What does Jesus say? No, we got to go down the mountain. There was still a journey to go into the valley. He goes down, and what's the first thing? He casts out a demon of a child. Disputes had to be settled. Rejection had to be faced. The cross had to be carried. That's why Peter was terrified. That's why, if anything, we should be terrified. And if we're not, well, you got to have faith. You have to just move forward. The only reason we talk that way, people that talk that way aren't doing ministry, aren't sharing their faith, aren't reaching out. When you start doing that, you trust that God is with you. You need God with you because that's all we have. That's all we need. And the future was clear. It shapes the present, and it's urgent. The older I get, I also find I'm in a hurry more. I shouldn't be. I should be sitting on a porch and rocking. But I'm not. I see more here to do now than I did a month ago, a year ago, 2 years ago. And I see it with a sense of urgency and tremendous responsibility. Peter accepted to what Jesus said, obviously. But he also responded as I do, because sometimes we're afraid. I don't necessarily think God wants us to do that. Jesus says, be of good courage. But when I feel that way, when I feel the way I feel, it's because I know I can't do it. But I know that God can through me, through us, through his disciples. Peter saw the future. He knew what it held. Somehow he knew. Not detail, not step by step, but he knew. And when we feel that way, when we are believers, when we're Christians, when we wear that hat, as we have on constantly, we are compelled to go down the mountain. We are compelled to live differently. So now that you're a Christian, what's changed? If you have to think about that for any length of time at all, we need to think about it more. We're accountable to the future. We are God's future in the present. We live in the sure knowledge of what it is, of what God calls us to do. It's a place where Jesus in the future is the Lord of all time in the present moment. So let's go down the valley together. The valley's full of illness. It's not a place I can see where let's build booths. There's sick people down there. There's people asking for gas money. There's people asking for a place to live. There's people that are hungry. There's people that are mad as hell. And probably it's because they're in pain of one sort or another. These are the challenges that Jesus brings. Knowing that if we serve any other than the Lord, after what we know, after what we've read, after what Peter saw, it's betrayal. It's desertion. I don't blame Peter one bit. Let's bypass the pain and sorrow. Let's take a detour. You know what's best? Let's go right to the future. Paul, in his writings, was not far from that. I'll stay here. I know there's work to do, but far be it. I want to be with Jesus in heaven. There was a time, and there still is today, but there was a time 40 years ago. I remember seeing my two children. Maybe they were ages 5 and 4, 7 and 6, doing different things. My greatest memory is watching a son on this big wheel flying around the driveway while his sister, a year and a half younger, was trying to roller skate. And you know how you're running around making sure he doesn't get too far out into the road. You're trying to get close to your daughter so she doesn't fall and hit her head because she's skating and she's new at it. You watch him. You watch him so carefully. And it seems like yesterday. And it's just a freeze frame when you see that. And sometimes in the midst of that 5 and 6 year old, I saw a 26 and a 24-year-old. I saw them all grown up. And then the light changed and they'd be back to their big wheel and roller skates. They were children again. But I saw it. There was no escaping it. It was a wonderful moment, but it was frightening. It's like being up there on that mountain. You're terrified. This is your flesh and blood. And now they're not just roller skating, they're on big wheels. They're in cars going to proms. They're in college far, far away. See, every present moment, whenever we have it, is touched with a glimpse of the future. For me, I knew I wouldn't be forever their protector or guide, and I'm not quite sure sometimes what kind of a job I did when I tried to do that. Every experience in the present nurtures the adulthood already growing in them. In Jesus Christ, we see in the Son what God's future is like. The present is like. It's what Mark calls the good news as he moves through his record. And Mark knew the other side too. Knowing we are responsible for tomorrow, for the future. To the one who is able to keep us from falling, to present you faultless before the presence of his glory with exceeding joy. To the only wise God, our Savior, be glory and majesty, dominion and power, now and forever. Amen.